The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Returning from the region of Tyre, Jesus went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a man who was deaf and who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. You know, while I was a journalism student at the Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication, learning the trade of reporting the news, I actually wound up rather unusually being assigned as a teaching assistant in the School of Communication. That's the more academic side of things there. And there I was thrown into the deep end of having to really catch up quickly with the whole theoretical consideration of just how a society on a mass scale communicates to itself information vital to its good operation as a community, how popular opinion is formed, how people can be manipulated by the media. Now, one of the starting points in that whole field of study is in reflecting on something known as Plato's cave. It's a story from the ancient philosopher Plato. It's a conversation he writes down between Socrates, that famous philosopher, and one of his students about how it is that we know the things about the world around us, how we know what we know. Now, the cave is a metaphor for this, and Socrates explains that we're like prisoners put in a cave as children, with our back to the entrance to that cave, chained and restrained so that we can only look at the interior walls of the cave. What we know about the world we get from the shadows made on the walls as things pass the cave mouth in daylight. And over time, we collectively come to interpret what we see and agree what all the shadows mean. Then Socrates tells a little story. He says that one day, one of the prisoners escapes, and in reaching the cave entrance is absolutely dazzled by the real world that he sees with all its color and detail. He immediately turns around, he races back into the others. But as you know, if you've ever gone from being outside in the bright sunlight into a darkened house, your eyes don't adjust very quickly. And so this escaped prisoner, he stumbles and trips all over himself in his excitement, and he tries to share what he has seen with his friends. But the other prisoners just scoff at him. And they say, how can you have seen anything? You're clearly blind. And they won't believe him. So he leaves, despairing of his friends, and he goes out into the real world, very much alone. Now, one of the striking things about Plato's parable that was noted in our own conversation about it way back when my undergraduate days is how the people in the cave completely depend on what they see to tell them about the world. That the other senses actually are unengaged. And discussion is limited to just what the shadows on the walls mean. Speech is constrained thereby. And in the case of the escaped prisoner who returns, it's not to ask him questions about what he's seen, but rather to stop him from talking, because what he's saying is disturbing. And in the cave, it's like a movie theater today. People don't want you to talk. You get hushed and shushed by others. And if you do shout at the shadows, or in the case of a movie theater, at the figures on the screen, you quickly learn that they don't react to you. So speaking itself in that sense is pointless. And as in a soundproofed cinema, seated deep inside a cave, you don't hear much of the outside world. The awakening, or the restoration of the senses, is a consistent theme in the scriptures, in the Gospels. It is a metaphor for release from bondage, slavery to sin, but also oppression by one's enemies. In today's reading from Isaiah, we hear about God opening the eyes of the blind, unstopping the ears of the deaf, setting the mute to sing. Now we know how Jesus gives sight to the blind, and here in this story today, he restores hearing, but also speech. Now that's not a sense, but a human faculty of communication that's very important for participating in the world. Now, a little less now because of technology. We can type, we can send text messages, but at that time, in an oral culture of the first century, it was pretty indispensable that you be able to speak to make your thoughts known. And elsewhere, of course, in the Gospels, we hear Jesus say, "Those who have ears, listen." The Spirit of Christ allows us to hear, to see, to perceive the world more clearly. In large part because faith then replaces fear, and that frees us. And then we can speak of the reality we experience. Our concern in using our senses and exercising our faculties should be for the truth of things, the upholding of the ethic of loving service, the maintenance of human dignity. By that we serve Christ. I've spoken about getting hooked on the news before, watching obsessively the stream of what too generously is called news and information. I've also warned about being too dependent on one or two sources for all that you know about the world, because every story, absolutely every one, every news item, it carries a particular perspective, a bias, a worldview is embedded in that. It's how the reporter makes choices as to what he or she thinks is important, whether or not it is from another person's perspective. One becomes like the prisoners in the cave, if you do any of these things, who obsessively watch the shadows chained in place. And because it is so difficult to figure out from them what is going on, one actually begins to focus even more intensely on the shadows, such that you begin to ignore your other senses, and in silence you stare. And that makes someone very reactive to whatever is the latest, the last thing that's been seen. There's a lack of perspective, both in terms of the scope of vision, but also in time. One grows forgetful of what came before. One grows impatient for what is next, and so cannot calmly wait for more and better information. When one gets caught up in such a situation, one then also tends to grow very internally stressed, emotionally stressed, psychologically stressed, and you make bad decisions. You double down on them, even as further evidence mounts against doing so. Now, I've spoken about this before. I don't relish returning to this subject. Let me say at the outset that if you chose to receive the emergency experimental vaccines, I know that that decision has been made. I'm not looking to challenge that or discuss it. A lot of things went into the consideration of that matter. For some, it was a way to regain access to parents in nursing homes. For others, for real substantial health concerns. The risk versus benefit calculation came out in favor of the potential benefit. What worries me now is how public institutions and private corporations, sadly including the church, are being pulled into a dangerous narrative that could lead us down a very dark road as we all double down and in frustration lash out and demonize those who are pointing out what is so obviously known about the failure of the current strategy. The dominant narrative in the legacy media and coming from our institutions is that the only solution to our problem is everyone gets vaccinated. And vaccinated particularly with these emergency experimental vaccines. And if anyone refuses, we will make them. We will set aside conscience rights, our inherent human rights to deal with the situation. And remember what the situation is. This is a disease with a survival rate in excess of 99.5%, where according to the US National Safety Council, the chances of a fully vaccinated person dying are only slightly less than that of being struck by lightning. Think about the fact that the chances of you dying of a heart attack is 1 in 6. This would be a very worrying precedent, this forced application of vaccines, and will put in place the principle that we no longer have control over our bodies, that we cannot effectively exercise our consciences. The argument that the government is only facilitating restrictions that private businesses want really doesn't wash. This is a fusion of government coercion and business cooperation. It's the kind of thing that should outrage groups like Antifa, if that group was really about fighting for our rights. We cannot also give in to the conceit that it's just this one time. They'll never use this power again. Well, you may agree right now, but maybe not in a month's time, maybe not in a year's time. Now, I know that the Vatican is encouraging people to take the RNA vaccines because they meet our ethical standards. And this is rightly presented as an act of charity to our neighbors. However, a great many dioceses have made this clear, that Catholics also have conscience rights that allow them to make up their own minds on this matter. Some dioceses will provide letters of religious exemption to those who ask. Others will not. Our diocese does not. The Church nonetheless affirms your right of refusal if made in good conscience, and that you cannot be compelled to take any drug or undergo any medical procedure. That was established in international law at the Nuremberg trials that followed the Second World War. As I say, we are getting a very limited narrative and a dangerous one. When I take the time myself to see what other intelligent conversations about this matter are going on in the world, when I talk to intelligent people about their misgivings, I'm not encountering conspiracy-minded lunatics, but people with good questions and real concerns, and a needed criticism of how our governments and health authorities have handled things. I know people who are quite willing to be vaccinated, but not with the current offering of vaccines, and wonder why the insistence on these drugs that would not be in use but for the emergency authorization are insisted on. You know, at the outset of the pandemic, several different vaccine initiatives were put into motion. What we have now, we're the first to reach the stage at which the governments were willing to gamble on them. Other more conventional vaccines are on their way. For example, and you may have seen this, Novavax, which should be approved very soon. It is protein-based, it's from the United States. It uses the same technology, as I understand it, as vaccines for hepatitis. And I've read, actually, it has additional benefits over what's on offer right now. What about effective home treatment for those who develop symptoms once catching COVID? Why has the position been to leave people largely on their own? Why do doctors fear to treat their patients? Because of a climate of suspicion around those who talk about these therapies. It would go a long way to cutting down hospital numbers if people could be more effectively treated at home. And not by finding a cure-all drug, but by just proper discussion of how known and safe drugs could be used in combination early or to prevent severe symptoms. Yet to admit there might be some effective treatments out there, it's taken as undercutting the narrative that there is just this one solution. We should be looking at this more, as the current vaccines are apparently declining in their effectiveness. You know, Israel, as the most highly vaccinated nation, is an example of how this vaccine strategy doesn't work. 84% are double vaxxed. 86% of the new cases are in double vaccinated people. Again, the story we're hearing doesn't make sense when we begin to hear others who point out these undisputed facts. You know, H.L. Mencken, the 20th century writer and great wit, once wrote, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." We are dealing with a complex problem. I don't know the answers, but I try to listen. As people send me news of the latest study, point out the newest set of statistics, I try to listen and ask good questions, listen some more, and to not get thrown into a panic. I pray and meditate and listen for God's voice. Have Christ break the chains of fear that have me staring at shadows. Let the Spirit guide me to calm consideration of what can be reasonably known and then acted upon. The situation requires of us all that we have ears to listen to others, mouths to speak calmly and with thought to the things that are said. Christ has opened our ears to his word. He has freed our tongues to speak his truth. And in that there is to be no hate, vilification, fear-mongering, but rather confidence that in faithfulness to his teaching, in the respecting of others as we would respect him, the answers lie. To those who are afraid, be strong, be open. Amen.